Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first of this year's Delacorte, the series of Delacorte lectures. And we're very lucky to have with us Louis Lapham, who is, to me, the ideal person to inaugurate this year's Delacorte lecture series. I'm going to let him tell you about Lapham's Quarterly, which is his new, very extraordinary magazine that he founded and he edits. He was the editor of Harper's magazine twice, and he can tell you how he was the editor of Harper's magazine twice for any number of years if he wants to, or you can tease it out of him in the question period. He has had his own TV series. He's had his own radio series. He's the author of many books, among them Money and Class in America. He should know. His grandfather was the mayor of San Francisco. His great-grandfather was the founder of Texaco. If you go to Lapham's Quarterly's website, you'll discover that the New York Times compares him to H.L. Mencken. Vanity Fair compares him to Mark Twain. And Tom Wolfe compares him to Montaigne. And he told me that when he left the Tribune, a colleague from which is here with us tonight, they gave Tom Wolfe his desk, so he may know whereof he speaks anyway. As for myself, rather than comparing him to anyone else, I'll just say, as I told my class today, a couple of members of whom I see here, Louis gave me, he may not remember this, the best job I ever had. My job was to go to lunch with him once a month at a restaurant of my choosing and discuss ideas. For this, I got a monthly check. It should happen to you. I got a great meal and a chance to do what you have the chance that you have this evening, which is to talk with Louis Lapham. Louis, why don't you come up here and... All yours.
I had lunch with Victor because I made it a practice whenever I was running a magazine or to surround myself with people smarter than myself and pick their brains. And when I first became editor of Harper's magazine in the middle 70s, my rabbi in New York was an editor at Harper and Row, and we had a long and expensive lunch, and then he said, I can tell you everything you have to know about being an editor in one word. And I said, what is that word, oh sage? And he said, steal, by which he meant surround yourself with bright people, listen to what they have to say, give writers their head, essentially. Don't try to tell them what to write, but help them to write what they want to write. So Victor told me I could just talk at random and sort of tell the narrative of my own experience in journalism and its various facets over the last 50-odd years, and I'll do that. And then I'm happy to answer any kind of question you want to ask at the end. I like taking questions, and I'll wait to the very end to talk about Lapham's Quarterly, but I started as a copy boy for the San Francisco Chronicle between my last year at Yale University in 1956 and then I took a postgraduate course in Cambridge, England. I thought I was going to become an historian, but I discovered I didn't really have the temperament for footnotes, and also in those days, Cambridge did not give an MA, it only gave a PhD, which was going to be 3 years, and in those days, the American universities would not accept a Cambridge degree. They wouldn't give you any credit for it, so you'd have to do it all over again in the United States, and I figured that by that time I'd be 35, and so I came back to the States I was in Cambridge in the fall of 1956, which was both the Hungarian Revolution and the Suez Crisis. And among the young British students my own age, several of them went to Hungary to take part in the revolution. If you remember, that was supposed to have been backed by the American CIA, and the American CIA pulled out at the last moment. And of the Englishmen that I knew, two were killed. And so they came back to Cambridge and very angry at American foreign policy. And suddenly I was having to explain the foreign policy of John Foster Dulles, which I was not up to doing. At Yale, I hadn't paid much attention to foreign affairs. I'd spend most of my time reading people like Camus or Brecht or Auden, so I was not informed, and nor had I worked for the college newspaper. I thought that wasn't a sufficiently serious endeavor. But anyway, I come back to the States in the summer of '57, and I went to Washington, and I applied for jobs at the White House, the CIA, and the Washington Post. And in those days, those were all essentially the same place. The division in opinion in the country doesn't happen until the Vietnam War in the '60s. So it's at the zenith of the Cold War, and I got nowhere with the Post because I didn't have enough experience. I'd had 3 months as a copy boy, and that wasn't enough. White House, I had an interview with the guy who was the patronage officer for Eisenhower, and I had the interview in the downstairs in the barber shop. He was sitting in the barber chair. I was sitting on the toilet at the level of his shoes, which were extremely well polished. And he told me that if I wanted to get into politics, I had to go to, you didn't start at the White House, you went to some county or city machine and worked your way slowly into the confidence of the local politicians. And then I went to the CIA. The CIA, in those days, it was still in a Quonset hut near the Lincoln Memorial. They didn't have the headquarters at Langley. And I had a very romantic idea. I mean, the Cold War is at its zenith. And I've been talking to my British friends about the Hungarian Revolution, and I had visions of myself wearing a trench coat and an extremely beautiful German blonde girl on the last train from Berlin. I had that kind of idea about what the CIA would be. So there was a week of physical exam and psychological and so forth, and then we got to the interview. And it's in the Quonset hut. There's one long plain wood table. I'm 22. The three people that are interviewing me are in their late 20s, and they're all from Yale, and they all look like George W. Bush. That white shoes, button-down blue shirt, blazer, and khaki pants. And I had really studied for this thing. I mean, I didn't quite have notes written on my cuff, but if I could have, I would have. I mean, I'd crammed, so I was prepared to talk about the last days of the Romanovs, the Finland station, the 4 roads through the Argonne forest, the Fulda Gap, and so on. And the first question, I love this story because it's a true story, and it's also tells me all I really have to know about American foreign policy and our intelligence services. the first question was, you are standing on the 13th tee of the National Golf Links in Southampton. What club do you hit? So that's a bit of a trick question. I mean, clearly what they're asking me is not, what do I know about policy? Am I any good at languages? They want to know whether or not I'm the right sort. I'm being essentially interviewed for a fraternity or a varsity team, you know, great varsity game in the Cold War. But I got that question right because I had played the golf course, and it's a short hole, so first of all, you have to know that, and then if you're hitting a 7-iron, you're a good player. If you're hitting a 4-iron, not so good. And so I got that question right. Second question, it is 6 o'clock on 6 p.m., August 31st, and you are coming into the yacht harbor at Hay Harbor on Fisher's Island. What tack are you on? I'd also done that, so I knew that. I got that one right. Third question was, does Minxie Haynes wear a slip? Minxie was the wild thing of the Ivy League circuit in the 50s. And she was a very, very pretty girl, and the flagrant in her behavior. And if one had not had carnal knowledge of Minxie, one was really the right sort. And, and I said, gentlemen, I'm sorry to say that my sources are secondhand and Romanian. I have rumors of French silk and Belgian lace, but beyond that, I don't know. And I said, and beside that, I'm terribly sorry I've wasted your time because I've clearly come to the wrong place. And I got up and walked out. And but the various blunders of the CIA ever since, I've never been surprised. I then went to back to San Francisco, which is where I was born and where I'd worked as a copy boy on the Chronicle. And through family connection, got a tryout as a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, Hearst paper, monarch of the dailies, the first paper that Hearst ever owned. Hearst was thrown out of Harvard in the 1880s and came to Washington, where his father was a senator from California. His father had won the Examiner in a poker game, and young William Randolph persuaded his father to give him the paper and let him. He said, I think I have an idea about how to run a newspaper. But that was the San Francisco Examiner. I was sent to the police beat in Oakland. The press room in Oakland was straight out of front page. It had been the same thing since the 20s. There were 5 guys there was Dugarry of the Chronicle, Swan of the Call Bulletin, Rafferty of the Examiner. They had police radios. They spent most of the day lying on couches with hats over their faces and calling in murders and accidents and trying to move as little as possible. I was the cub, and therefore I was the one that had to go out and be at the scene of the crime or the scene of the accident with a photographer whose name was Seymour Snare. Seymour, Dickens couldn't have made it up. I mean, he was dark glasses, swarthy, dressed like a mobster, and a big speed graphic camera. And I can remember we got once to we got to a tenement in which a young lady had shot her boyfriend, and we got there because we had the police radio in the car. We got there at the same time that the police did, and the not quite deceased was actually bleeding to death on the floor. And the girl still had the gun in her hand, and she had no idea how it went off or why. But the snare, the police were very easy to work with in Oakland. I mean, they anything for the press, and Seymour courted them. He knew them all by their first names, and so Seymour got this girl to. He said, "I want you to pose, over the body." And he said, "Could you wear a bathing suit?" And first he got her in the bathing suit, and the police are encouraging her. They say, "This will help. It'll go well with the judge." And then Seymour got her to pose, and he said, "Well, do you have a negligee? Do you have a nightgown of any kind?" And she did, and Seymour got that photo, and that's my introduction to the police beat. My introduction to writing for a newspaper was I was sent to a flower show in Piedmont, Claremont, and I wrote 4,000 words about the flower show. I'd been to Cambridge. C.S. Lewis had been my tutor, and I handed this in to Rafferty, the examiner, and he read it. He looked at me and he said, "Those are the most beautiful 4,000 words I've ever read. I have tears in my eyes. Never have I seen daffodils described," and so on. But he said, "Do me a favor," he said, "see if you can cut it in half." And so, painfully, I cut the manuscript in half. Every word a loss to mankind. And I gave it back to Rafferty, and he said, "Lewis, I mean, I didn't believe it's possible, but these 2,000 words are even more beautiful than the first 4,000. But he said, "Do me a favor and cut it in half again." Well, we went through this for a couple of days. It showed up in the Sunday paper as one paragraph. And that was my opening lesson in how to write for newspapers. I stayed in San Francisco for 2 years and learned to be a city-side reporter, City Hall, crime, and so forth, and also rewrite. But in those days, Underwood upright typewriters, linotype machines, big presses in the building, ink-stained wretches. I mean, I was the only Ivy League person on the premises, and in those days, there was still nothing glamorous about being a journalist, and one never used the word journalist. That was a word reserved for Englishmen and fops. But one was a newspaper reporter or a newsman, and so I learned the business at that level, and I found it very exciting. But then after about two years, I began to get restless, and I wanted to go to a better newspaper. I mean, I understood that this was a tabloid, and I wanted to go to New York and work for the Times or the Herald Tribune or the Wall Street Journal. So I applied, and I also had, there came a day where there was a story about a ship. A ship had sailed from Oakland. It was en route to Japan, where it was going to be broken up for scrap. This was the ship's last voyage. And it sunk 3 miles west of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I was sent to cover the sinking. And the sinking, of course, was utterly routine. I mean, the crew had taken one look at the ship, and knew that it wasn't going to get much further than 3 miles west of the bridge. So they hadn't even changed their shirts. They were all dressed as if prepared to go ashore, and had their suitcases packed, and the Coast Guard arrived, and they stepped off, everybody as dry as possible, and no drama whatsoever. And I came back to the office and I wrote it that way. And the managing editor said to me, Lewis, he said, "You're never going to be a newspaper reporter." He said, "We can't do it. Where's the headline?" Anyway, so I then went to New York, got a job with the Tribune, worked for the Tribune for 2.5 years, and then got, again, the same kind of wonderful assignment. I mean, all over the city, sent down to write the color story for the first space shots from Cape Canaveral. I had a contest with Gay Talese. Gay Talese was writing for the Times. I was the Tribune, and we were the reporters that we got assigned the color story, not the headline, but the sidebar where you have the human interest, and you get to use the occasional adjective. But then I began to run up against the problem, for me, the problem of length and what you could actually do with a newspaper story at 300 words. You were finding yourself essentially just taking statements from public officials. Whether they were true or not didn't really matter. I mean, it's what the mayor said, or it's what the general said, or the candidate, and I didn't feel it was. I wanted to write it at longer length, right, and try to write for the magazines. And this is 1962, so I left the Tribune. And to tell you how disappointed I was at that time with the daily newspaper form, I quit, and the managing editor said, "Don't quit. We will make you the foreign correspondent. We'll make you the correspondent in Rome." And not only in Rome, because when I'd first come to the Tribune, I had hoped to become a foreign correspondent. And he said, not only can you go to Rome, you'll be in Rome, but you can have the whole Mediterranean. I mean, and there was civil war going on in Algeria, there was civil war going on in Cyprus, but even so, I'd spent too much time at the Tribune as a late rewrite desk, and the phone would come in, the guy would call me from Moscow or the Congo, and I'd be taking down a story. And then the managing editor would look over my shoulder and tell me what I was really writing about. And so I only used this guy's painfully acquired information as notes and write it the way the editors wanted to see it written. And I figured that better to write for a Saturday Evening Post. So I went off to the Saturday Evening Post. I had a contract there for write 8 pieces a year for $5,000 a manuscript, which in 1962 was quite a lot of money. And I spent half the year anyway traveling. I went all over the country. I went quite a few different places in the world for the Post, and got to write at the length of 6, 7, 10, sometimes 12,000 words. And the man who was the editor of the Post at the time was a man named Otto Friedrich, and it's from Friedrich. Everything I know about the magazine business is really, I learned it from Otto. He was, in my view, a marvelous man. very fine writer, historian, and he at the same time, over the course of his life, while he was the editor of the Post, and after the Post folded in 1968, he then became one of the top editors at Time. But in the meantime, he wrote 8 books. A book about Berlin in the 20s, a book about Manet, a book about Henry Adams's wife, a book about roses, a book about the Krupp family. I mean, he just, whatever interested him, he'd pursue it. And superb writer. And during my time at the Post, my ambition was to one day be able to turn in a manuscript that would get past Friedrich without too much revision, without too many, exclamation points, awful, awkward, and stuff like that, comments in the margins. I never succeeded in doing that. And usually I would spend, I'd spend 2 days writing the lead, the first 400 words, every word carefully chosen. I mean, it might as well have been polished with some kind of vermeil. And Otto invariably would cut the first 3 pages and say that the piece starts here on page 3 with the story. And he was always right. And after a while, I learned how to do that. So we didn't have to cut quite as much anyway. I got to the story quicker. The Post folded, and I then went to I made the same kind of deal with Life magazine. And I had the same kind of contract, traveled around the country, wrote at length on all kinds of subjects. And then Life folded, and I then became a contract writer for Harper's magazine. That was Willie Morris, the editor from Mississippi, was at that time the editor, and among the other contributing writers were David Halberstam was one, I was one, John Corey was another one, and there were 5 of us. And but there became a big, my first assignment for the Post was, I spent 4 months in Alaska, in Juneau, Alaska, because it was the year of the oil discovery on the North Slope. And suddenly the state of Alaska had, from British Petroleum and Mobil, something like $950 million in the hands of the state. And $950 million in 1970 was a lot of money. I mean, it would be well into the billions in today's money. And so I went to spend the whole term of the legislature in Juneau to see what they would do with the money. Because here's the chance, it was a clean slate. Tabula rasa, funds free of the corrupt private interests, chance to do all kinds of things for the public good, build schools, roads, I mean, all the wonderful things that politicians promise you that they will do. And of course, they did practically none of them. They were like Eskimos falling on a beached whale. You just cut it up into all kinds of special interest deals. But it was a lesson to behold. I mean, I was there practically every day of the legislative session, and I got to know the people in the state senate as well as in the state legislature, and met a lot of quite a few Eskimos and Indians as well as Alaskan frontiers people. Okay, I'm back in New York. Willie Morris gets himself in an argument with the owner. The owner of Harper's Magazine in those days was the Coles family from Minneapolis. Coles family was one of the big media families in the United States in the 50s. One brother, Gardner Coles, owned Look magazine. The other brother, John Coles, owned the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, 12 papers around Denver, 10 papers around Baltimore, Harper and Row, the publishing house, the CBS franchise both in Minneapolis and in, I think, Fargo, North Dakota. It was a fairly big media empire. And John and Willie, they didn't have. It's a long story, and it's the same kind of story that you've heard many, many times about when there's bouleversement within the editorial publishing side of. It happens regularly. The result was that everybody quit and defiant walked out, thinking that Coles would bring. Well, it was a failed coup d'état, and but I didn't, because I didn't agree with the positions being taken by my colleagues. So then on Tuesday I was a writer and had only been in the office twice to bring in 2 different manuscripts, and then on the next day, the Wednesday, I'm suddenly the de facto managing editor, and so I got to become an editor by accident. I learned on the job over a period of about 9 years, and then in 1980, John Coles folded the magazine. At that point, the oldest magazine in America, 150 years, I can't remember at least 150 years by that time. And it was rescued at the last moment by the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. And I mean at the last moment. I mean, everybody had gone except myself and the art director. I had kept some manuscripts in case an angel appeared out of nowhere. The angel did appear. And we kept the magazine going without missing an issue. 6 months later, the foundation appointed a group of directors to manage the magazine, gave it a board of directors. And I had my first meeting with the board of directors and knew within 10 minutes of the meeting that my days were numbered. I mean, I was clearly going to be fired. The only question was I going to be in next week or 6 weeks or how long? It happened 6 months later, and so I was fired from Harper's Magazine. Spent 2 years in exile in New York, writing occasional pieces for other magazines. I had a column that ran every 2 weeks in the Washington Post, and a little of this and a little of that. Then I got rehired. That's a long story too, but I agreed to go back to Harper's Magazine on the condition, only on 3 conditions, that all of the members of the board of directors who fired me be themselves fired. 1. 2, that I could completely redesign the magazine, because by that time I find myself, Harper's at that point was publishing, as was the Atlantic, publishing once a month, maybe 9 pieces of some length, 4,000, 5,000 words. And that meant that I was reading 50 manuscripts in order to get 9, and most of them were not very good. I mean, it's very hard to write a really good magazine article, and the talent is rare, and to find 10 good magazine articles in all of the magazines in a year, you're lucky. To find 9 every month is impossible. So I devised what the section called readings in the front, and had a couple of other things. I had, new forms, and this was done in 1984, same year that the first Mac computer came out, and a lot of the readings were, well, what they really were, they could have been blogs. I mean, none of them were longer than 750 words, sometimes 1,200, and we took them from, they were found objects. I mean, we took them from small magazines. We took them from obscure sources all over the world, and it was a wonderful excitement to do that, because reading most long-form articles up until that time, I mean, there was some of it that was really very good, but you didn't need most of the flying buttresses that were on a lot of these manuscripts. When those readings came out, the criticism in New York was, how could you possibly do this? You've made everything too short. You've lost so forth and so on. On the other hand, that it was geared to people who were learning to read at shorter lengths, and that, of course, became more and more obvious as the 1980s wore on. So I continued doing Harper's Magazine, taught myself how to write an essay. At the same time, I did a 6-part television documentary on American power, American foreign policy in the 20th century. I did it for an English production company, and I enjoyed that. That I had, because I wrote it on set. We would get to Guatemala, or we get to Cuba, or we get to Vietnam, and you talk to the photographer and figure out what his angle was and what the background was going to be, and then you'd write at least I would write the voiceover to fit the scene. So it wasn't like writing captions; it had a more coherent feeling. And that of course was, when it came out, it was perceived as being communist, and it wasn't. It was just talking about the practice of American foreign policy over the course of the 20th century, essentially making the world safe for American capital. But it was not tendentious, but that was the way the story plays out. But anyway, it was a success in England. It was not a success here. The PBS was very upset with it. And then I also did for 3 years, I had a book show on television where I would take a different book every week and have the author and then one or sometimes 2 other people, and we just have a conversation about it. And some of that was a lot of fun, because again, there's no script, and I try to mix it up with cross purposes, cross discipline. Jonathan Miller, a truly marvelous British, he was one of the Beyond the Fringe guys, but he's a psychiatrist, he's a polymath, he's a genius, and also a musician, and he'd written a book about Mozart. And so the conversation was Miller, his book Mozart, and the other person in the conversation was Edward Said. Edward Said was a Middle East scholar, Palestinian point of view, but also a truly fine pianist. And so the conversation went back and forth between music and politics and psychology. It was that kind of show. But I had a sponsor, which was the Bell Atlantic Phone Company, and then the Bell Atlantic Phone Company got taken over, and the new management decided they didn't want to have anything to do with culture or books, and they wanted to spend money on golf tournaments. So that was the end of that. And then in 2006, I decided to start this quarterly magazine, going back to my original passion, which was history. And so I quit Harper's Magazine, and at the age of 72, spent the first year raising money, managed, to my great good fortune, to find an office in the same building with The Nation magazine. The Nation is my landlord and has been for the last 7 years. And to me, the magazine is history. The idea is to take a subject that's in the news, money, comedy, religion, war, politics, food, sex, and then bring to bear on that topic the great writers who are, so my contributors are all very A-list. Shakespeare and Thucydides and Virginia Woolf and Tolstoy and so on, and so it's a joy to read. And I finally said to myself, time is running out, and I don't want to spend a lot of that time reading second-rate manuscripts. I want to read the writers that get to the point, so we've been doing that, and it's turned into a success. Started out with 3,000 subscribers that came from Harper's Magazine, who I'd left as the editor, and I'd written a column for a lot of time, so they subscribed to the new magazine, and now we have a paid subscription of 30,000. And we sell another 12,000 every quarter in the bookstore, mostly in Barnes and Noble. And and we started. We also have started a podcast, which is beginning to develop some listeners. For 4 years, I did a weekly podcast for Bloomberg News on history. I'd take a new book of history every week, talk to the author for 20, 25 minutes, but then Bloomberg, just 2 months ago, wiped out its whole cultural news division, concentrate on money, and they used to have shows on the arts and on books, and none of that anymore. So we will now do the podcast. Given the technology, we could actually do it right out of the office, out of our sub-tenant Nation office, and gradually build it up that way. And beginning, we will, I think, and we'll do other podcasts. We also, on the podcast, we have, you'll see in the magazine that we have pieces by famous writers, and we get famous actors to read from the magazine into the podcast, and that goes out. And you can do all this now without a studio. I mean, you can literally, I mean, it's wonderful, what's available. To find an audience, of course, another problem. To make money, that's another problem. But the way there is a way to do the podcast, and if you can build it the right way, you can get advertising for it. And so we're working on that, and we signed a contract to do online education along the model of the quarterly, that is to say, we do segments, we do content for sixth grade public school students in 50 states. We do it through a company called Amplify Learning, which is a new online company that Murdoch bought 2 years ago for $400 million, and they have contracts in states everywhere in the country. They do the basic curriculum, and what we do is added material, so that we will do, in the American history curriculum, for example, we will do half an hour on the Gold Rush, and the Gold Rush will have text by the people who were there: Mark Twain, William Tecumseh Sherman, Bret Hart, and that'll come up beautifully printed on the screen. But then they will also get music from the period, Oh Susanna on the banjo. They'll get maps, film. We could take clips from Hollywood film just for the photography. I mean, not for the dialogue, but for the, if you want the view of the Sierra Nevada. And there's also, and then of course there are the photographs from. We have old photographs of San Francisco Bay in 1849, maps on how you got from San Francisco to Poker Flat, lists, what did it cost? You get off the ship in San Francisco Bay, and you want to go to the gold fields, and you need a mule, and you need a shovel, and you need blue jeans. This is, of course, where Levi Strauss got started. And, but there's a list, and all these things come up in multimedia half an hour, and it's very rich material. So we're doing that, and I have no idea where that's going to go. But we have a contract to do 24 of these things, and if they work, I mean, if Amplify finds that there's a market for it, if teachers like it, if the kids like it, then who knows? I mean, we might end up doing more of it, and then I'd have to hire some more people from the nation. But I could go on a long time. But I'm giving you. You can ask any question you want, and I'm happy to answer.
Great. Thank you, Louis. It's a panorama of what's happened in publishing in this country, so it's very helpful. Let me take moderator's privilege and ask the first question, but I invite the rest of you to ask your question from that microphone out there. We're being filmed, and this is going to be seen far and wide, or on the Columbia Journalism Television Network, such as it is. You told these events, Louis, but you left out some of the dramas of them. Okay. I assume that there was huge fuss made when you didn't quit Harper's with all the rest of the people who left in support of Willie Morris. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, there was a very big fuss. Willie had got himself in a bind with Coles. Coles, remember, this is 1971, and the country is divided into Eastern, hippie, liberal people on the one hand, and then Middle Western, hard hat, army people, patriots on the other hand. And there's quite a lot of bad feeling on both sides of this equation. Coles is, and the Minneapolis Tribune is in our context would now be right wing. Willie was very much New York, intellectual, lanes, against long hair, against the establishment, so forth and so on. And the magazine was losing a lot of circulation. Because Willie, to tell you the truth, was not a very good magazine editor. He became very self-indulgent and would give people all kinds of space and to really run on to no purpose.
But the people were people like Norman Mailer. Didn't they need that space, Louis?
Well, yeah. Mailer did, but I mean, yeah. There weren't that many of, you know, when you come back to it. I mean, yeah, Mailer wrote The Prisoner of Sex. I can remember he wrote that for Harper's Magazine at great length. I think he took the whole issue. Right. It did not sell. It was a disaster on the newsstand. But this is the period of what was called the new journalism, and people had great and showy reputations. Some of it was very good, a lot of it was not. But Willie refused to change. Cole said to him, in effect, listen, Morris, unless you do something and revise the magazine or add other components to it and don't have it written only by the same 4 or 5 people every month, try and correct it. And Willie's attitude was like my attitude with the flower show. To cut a word or a line is a crime against humanity. And so Willie then resigned, thinking that Coles would change his mind. In other words, Willie said, unless you do it my way, I resign. Never thinking that Coles would accept his resignation. But Coles did, and so Coles came in. Flew in from Minneapolis. There was a meeting in the St. Regis Hotel at 10 o'clock at night. I had not been part of this. I mean, I'd been to the magazine, as I said, twice, and I was contract writer, not part of the inner circle. And I didn't even know that the meeting was going to take place at the St. Regis until an hour beforehand. And I called up Halberstam and I said, where's the meeting? And he told me it was at the St. Regis, and I said, what is the meeting about? And he said, you don't have to know, you just do what we do. So I went to the meeting, and what they did was also try to blackmail Willie. I mean, with Coles. And I just didn't see it from their point of view. You have to remember, at this point in time, had been with the Herald Tribune, which had gone out of business. I'd been with another magazine that I founded in the early 60s called USA One. That had gone out of business. Saturday Evening Post had gone out of business, and Life had gone out of business. So
you think you had the magic touch?
I had a magic touch, and I was not about to walk away from another train wreck if there was any hope in salvaging it. So I stayed, everybody else resigned, and then I became, an enemy I mean, my reputation in the New York literary world went straight down. I mean, I was suddenly seen as a scab or as a friend of management, I mean, along those lines. So yeah, there was a lot of drama in it, right?
Okay. All right, so you ought to all join in this conversation and
Hi,
and tell us who you are.
my name is Alan Dodds Frank. I graduated from Columbia Journalism in 1970 and went to the Anchorage, Alaska Daily News. And I have to tell you that by 1972, when I was the Juneau bureau chief, that the Lewis Lapham story should be looked up and read by every person in this room. It remains one of the great classics. And he also was kind enough to let me try to write 10,000 words as a follow-up. Actually, he asked for 2,000, but I wrote 10,000. Yeah. And I never finished it. I ended up going to the Washington Star instead. Yeah. So I came here to thank him for that, but I didn't think he was going to mention the story.
Yeah.
But my question really is, what's your feeling about what's happened to journalism?
Good.
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of different moving parts. I mean, it's very hard to. There's still very good journalism, and there's what happened in the 80s was it began to divide quite sharply according to polemical or partisan lines. I mean, I can remember in the 70s, I was able to publish in the same issue Michael Harrington and Irving Kristol. And I went out of my way to try to do that. I mean, to try to publish writers on different sides of the argument. And I can remember being, in the same year that I was being accused of being a communist by PBS, Alec Coburn in the Village Voice was referring to me as Attila the Hun, because I would publish writers on the right as well as on the left. After Reagan gets to be president, and after the people like Rush Limbaugh start to show up on the FCC, gives them a license to do that, then it divides. I mean, I would try to do a forum in the Quarterly. I mean, I'm sorry, in Harper's, and get people from the left and the right. And they'd say to me, well, I'm not going to go on the same stage with X or Y. And so certain parts of journalism began to divide along those lines. It also, there's a kind of I was never, for example, an admirer of Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward and Bernstein came to Harper's Magazine in the early 70s, and with all the President's Men before it offered me the first serial rights before it had been published. And I turned it down because there was no named source. I said, you know, what the hell is this, you know? And so there became you know, the element of gossip began to creep into journalism. It became I'm sure it was always this way, but it was about access. You know, whether you were going to get, if you'd be taken into the confidence of the press corps and I was sent down by the Post to write about the Johnson White House. The Kennedy White House, everybody had the idea it was Camelot and romantic and attractive, and people were young and beautiful and so on. But what was the Johnson White House going to be like? And the Post sent me down to the Hay Adams Hotel across the Lafayette Park from the White House, and I had a suite. And they say, stay as long as it takes. You know, stay 3 months, 4 months, whatever you need. And you could still do that kind of thing in the 60s with Post, and that's why I could stay in Juneau for that length of time. I don't know what, there are very few magazines, maybe the New Yorker or Vanity Fair can still afford that, but I wouldn't think as often or as regularly as it was being done in the 60s. Because in the beginning of the 60s, the Post and Life were the major media in, let's say, 1960. If the President of the United States wanted to talk to the American people, Kennedy, would give an interview on the back page of Life magazine to Teddy White, or on the back page of the Saturday Evening Post to Stuart Alsop. By 1970, they were talking to the television. Television takes over print in the 60s. And there's a wonderful scene in Russell Baker's memoir. Russell Baker was a columnist for the New York Times, and I was a great admirer of Baker's column. I thought he was a superb journalist. And as a young man, he was very successful as a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And then he was hired by the Times, and he actually covered Queen Elizabeth's coronation. And in 1960, he was the White House correspondent for the Times covering the election. And he describes this in his memoir. He goes to the Nixon-Kennedy debate, and he writes it. He sits there and he listens to it, and he's hearing what they're saying and taking notes, writes a story, in those days, the way one did on a portable typewriter. And then after he sent the story to New York, he goes up to the press lobby or press lounge, wherever it was, and sees it on television and knows that he's missed the story. Because Kennedy wins it on television because of the way he looks and the way it sounds and the way it plays as a picture. Whereas in terms of what was said, in Baker's view, clearly Nixon had won the debate going away. And he says to himself, I'm here at the absolute zenith of my career as a journalist. He's saying that words to this effect in his memoir, his autobiography. I'm 30 years old, and I'm at the top of my profession, and I'm gone. I'm toast. Because the television is where it's at. So that happens. I mean, that's one of the things that happens to journalism over the last 50 years. I can remember once I was, I'll say it again, back to Washington, Johnson. It's the spring of 1965. I'm in the Hay Adams Hotel. I walk across the park every morning to the west wing of the White House, and I had told George Reedy on the first day when I presented my credentials that I was from the Saturday Evening Post and I was only going to be here once and I wasn't coming back. And as far as I was concerned, nothing was off the record. And he said, fine, because clearly I was never going to get close enough to anybody where anything I was never going to hear anything anyway. But on the odd chance that something might have happened, I just wanted to establish that at the beginning. And that was fine with Reedy, because Reedy knew I was never going to be a threat to anybody. But it truly upset the press corps. The press corps said, you can't do this. This is not the way it's done here. And because they knew that if I was there for 3 months or 4 months, I would make them probably look like fools, which of course I did, because Johnson would lie to them regularly. There was the Dominican crisis in June of 1965, and Johnson had 4 different stories about why the Marines were in the Dominican Republic and so forth. And the press swallowed every one of them. I mean, it was like feeding fish to seals. And that's what would be the lead of the news, and that would be page 1 the next day in the Times, and then change the day after, and so on. And I was writing over a longer arc. I mean, I'm not writing for the next day, so they knew that eventually, if that narrative would show up in the Saturday Evening Post, which it did, but to punish me for my presumption, they arranged it with the Secret Service that I had to go through the entire security check every day. I was never given a pass longer than 1 morning, and so on. And then
on the record every day.
Yeah. and then it's corrupting. I mean, I'm sure that there are people in the room who've done this, but when you get to be part of the presidential entourage, I mean, we would accompany. I was there long enough, so we'd travel. The press corps would travel with Johnson when he went to Texas, or when he went to North Carolina, or for a flower festival, or Texas to his ranch. And what you would do is you'd show up at the West Wing in the morning, and if we're going to be in Texas for 3 days, you bring your golf clubs and you bring your tennis racket, and leave them in the lobby, the White House West Wing, and the U.S. soldiers, infantry guys, would take them to the plane, and you wouldn't see them again until you got into your hotel room in Austin, courtesy of the U.S. Army, of course. But and after a couple of months of that, you get to feel like you're a prince among men. I mean, you begin to think you're a very important person, and it's corrupting, and it's hard not to have it corrupting. And it's the same thing when a politician takes you into his confidence and says, as Henry Kissinger once said to me, I can't remember under what circumstance, Lewis, I would only tell you this, and I really want to know what you think, because that is maybe what we will do in Israel. Complete bullshit. But I mean, it's so flattering that you think, my God, I mean, Kissinger is asking me my opinion. I mean, I'm suddenly of a rank with Thomas Friedman. I mean, it goes to your head, and so a lot, and that's the way that's the kind of journalism that I think Woodward does, and I also thought that that's the kind of, that was the kind of journalism that Tim Russert did. I mean, he just knew how to pour the butter on the great and the good. And I never wanted to get that close to the great and the good.
I have a question about, not about journalism
You
content.
should tell us,
Oh, my name's David Haydu. I teach here.
David, teachers
I have,
here.
yeah, I have a question not about journalism content, but about presentation and
About
form.
presentation?
About presentation and form. Here's my question. There's no question, it seems to me, that you're one of the fathers of digital journalism, even though you worked in print. If you look at the reading section of Harper's, the Harper's Index, the Harper's Annotation, we see 20 years before the web, well, I don't know, didn't do the math, but many years before the web, curation, aggregation, and visualization, all on the pages of Harper's. So two questions for you. One, if your methodology really was pilfering, if you stole everything, where did you get those ideas? And then how do you feel about what you've wrought? So much of the way that journalism is presented now is your doing or your fault. So how do you feel about it?
Well, I feel good about that because, as I told you before, I got used to reading long 7,000, 8,000 word articles, and what was worth it in that length was sometimes no more than 700 words, but you needed all this preamble and paraphernalia and to set it in that context. And that's the reason that I started the reading section. And I'll tell you, the other way that happened is I got, as I told you, I got fired from Harper's in 1981. I had an office in the MetLife building. It was then the Pan Am building, because I had a friend who was a fund manager, and he had a big office, and he gave me a cubicle on one of the high floors. And then I thought, how do politicians read? How do chief executives read? I mean, they read summaries. I mean, the way the president reads, or something is prepared for them every morning, and it's the items, the particular bits of news, or the stories on the edge of the consciousness that are prepared by their staff. And I thought, how would you do that? I thought. I mean, because remember, at this point, I'm out of a job. And as I say, my standing within the New York journalist community, because of the bouleversement at Harper's Magazine, is still not very high. And also, I've made enemies, because when I was writing a column for the Harper's Magazine in the 70s, I wasn't afraid to say what I thought, and sometimes that wasn't welcome. And so I thought, well, let me see if I can invent a kind of briefing book for top corporate management, because top corporate management, you know, they know a lot about economics and they know a lot about numbers, but they don't really know what the hell's going on in the world. I mean, some of them do, and I thought, let me just try to prepare how would that look, and from where would you draw your various bits of information, and that's what I was thinking about when I went back to Harper's, and I thought, okay, now I'm going to do it with Harper's Magazine.
And the index?
Same thing. The index was, I wrote a column like that for the Washington Post where I just made it all up, but ran it down. I mean, it was like taking a core sample into the culture or into the economy, and the way an oil drill works, you bring up a little bit of a tube and analyze the rock at different depths.
I don't want to.
And I just made a column up like that for the Washington Post, and then decided, okay, I will now, instead of making up numbers, I will make sure we get the right numbers.
I don't want to interfere with the line of students and others, so I'm going to call on you in 1 second, but I want to take one advantage and follow up David's question. Your selection of readings is a great thing because you're introducing people in short form to great literature. Yeah. But the implication to me of the question was what you have wrought online is the theft of huge amounts of material that are done by real investigative journalists that are recycled online by people who don't pay for it. And this arguably is degrading to the profession that you have dedicated your life to. Is that?
Well, well, you got to explain more of that to me, Victor, because what really long investigative stuff is being taken by the internet until after it has been published, let us say, in the New Yorker or the Nation? I mean, are people...
Well, it's after. That's true. It may be true that it's after. It is true because that's who they borrow from, steal from, however you want to put it. That's all.
Well, I mean, through...
Nothing,
I mean,
you know, maybe, as you say, it's...
Well, this was happening to me at Harper's, you know, all the time I was there, starting in the 70s. We would write long pieces. Not we. I mean, I'd send somebody, spend money. He'd spend, or she would spend two months in Waziristan or something like that, and then would write the piece for the quarter for Harper's. Piece would come, magazine would come out, and then a couple of days later, the Times would just take it without it would appear in one of Times's stories,
right,
without
attribution,
without any attribution. I mean, it would have, you know, it would have a different lead on it, or it would have a different date, but essentially it was our stuff without acknowledgement. I mean, right. I mean they. I mean, I can remember. I'll tell you another story. I mean, back to the days when I'm at the Tribune. I'm at the Tribune. As wire story comes in, not a wire story, a 4-paragraph story comes in from our man in Moscow, and I'm taking it on the phone. It's 4 paragraphs. It's about a meeting of the Soviet Socialist Science Academies. Science Academy met yesterday. I mean, like that. I mean, it looked like a press release, 4 paragraphs. And John Denson, who was the editor at the time, looked over my shoulder and he said, "This means World War III." I said, "I'm sure it does, sir, but I don't see the connection." And he said, "No problem." He said, "You call this number and it will be explained to you." And that was Zbig Brzezinski here at Columbia. And I called him up, Mr. Brzezinski, and I'm calling at the suggestion of John Denson, and we have these 4 paragraphs, and he says it means World War III. And Brzezinski said, "Of course it does." And then, you know, spins off some, you know, fantastic tale, and which I then write under a Moscow deadline. Our guy in Moscow, we put his name on it, and I'm writing it in New York. And they put it on the next day. It comes up in the paper on the next day in the off lead. It's column, page 1, column 8. There were 8 columns on page 1 in those days. And that came up in our, and there were still several editions. That one came up in our, it wasn't the morning edition. It was the one that came out about 9 o'clock at night. And of course, there was not a word about that in the Times. But the next day, for the morning edition, the next day's Times, they had it on page 1. Same story. but from their man in Moscow.
Right.
So my sources tell me that people who read the internet don't really read at great length in the internet. I mean, that there are studies that show that the average time spent on a page of print on the internet there is apt to be read only 3/4 of it, and they don't read it as carefully as I don't think you read investigation for that. I would want to read it, right, Victor, in The Nation or in The New Yorker. It would never occur to me, right. I mean, okay, so you're giving, people are stealing your stuff for their own uses. You mean that? You have a big piece, let's say, in The Nation, or you have a big piece in The New Yorker, and I steal it, or I take it, and I do something with it on the internet, and then I sell it. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, I don't want to. I want to hear what these folks have to say,
Oh,
but,
okay.
I'll say in brief what I'm concerned about, which is that because the internet, as you say, that all these hundreds of millions of people are reading it, they couldn't exist without the print world that you have been a part of.
That's
all of your
that's
life.
true, sure.
And that now that we're looking for new business models, you found a great old business model, but we're looking for new ones. I think there's going to have to be a radical change so that the online world is going to have to learn how to do what the old-fashioned print world has done. That's a personal view, and my question to you had to do with, if you accept David's view of what's happened at this point, where the internet seems to be degrading the news and recycling old things, do you feel guilty at all for help contributing to it through your great inventions? I took that to be an ironic observation that he made, actually. So.
No, I don't feel guilty about that at all. I mean, I feel, because, I mean, books are one thing, and the internet is another,
right.
and television is still something else. And the way people were reading, I mean, a person who's really interesting on this subject is Anthony Grafton,
Right.
the professor at classics professor at Princeton, and he gives a lecture on the history of reading, how people read. And in the 17th century, 16th and 17th century, people were reading the way we now read the internet. They were reading a little of this and a little of that, and trying to get their hands on as much as possible, because printing is fairly new. Right. It's only been around for 100 years, and it's such an excitement that they're all over the place, and they all steal from each other. I mean, all the Elizabethan playwrights are doing that all the time. I mean, I think the more good stuff there is to read, the better it is, I think. The problem is how do you get paid for it? Great. And my answer to that is this quarterly. Here I'm stealing, you would say. I'm stealing Aristophanes, Thucydides, and so on. And I'm paying second serial right, not to Thucydides, but to Penguin, or whoever has the translation. And those rates are fairly low. It's called second serial. But I don't feel like I'm hoping to, that the excerpt that I've taken is in and of itself a pleasure to read, and educational, and will perhaps persuade the reader to read the whole book, or go back to the Peloponnesian Wars or the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But I'm also, Victor, charging a fairly high number for this. I mean, I'm saying, okay, I'm making an object of value. and I'm going to sell it for $60 a year, and I'm going to sell it on the newsstand for $16 a year, and we have no advertising.
I think that's cheap at the price, but
It is, but it's still, it's, in other words, the idea is to put the value into the printed page.
Right. I am feeling guilty, Louis, because I see two anxious questioners, and I want you each to introduce yourselves and ask your question, and then let Louis take them both and deal with them together, because we're approaching our 9 o'clock deadline, and
Okay.
there you go. So
All right.
tell us who you are. And
My name
give
is
us
Damon
your-
Tabor. I went here a couple years ago. I'm now a freelance magazine journalist. I've written for your former employer. My question is, I'm wondering, it's a short one actually, I'm wondering what was the best piece of advice that you ever got with respect to magazine writing, crafting long form?
It was from Otto Friedrich. I mean, Otto Friedrich was truly a master at it, and he would always say, get to the story, you know. I mean, I try to be, stay with the narrative, and that's what don't try to overthink it or my tendency is to try to overwrite it, and the Otto would say, no, just try to get to the story.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. And we've got one more.
Good evening. My name is Malvina Mushtabradinum. I'm a doctoral student here in communications at the journalism school. My question is...
You have to speak a little louder, because you have a lovely voice, but I can't hear it.
My question is about... I was really struck by your description as to the genesis of Lapham's Quarterly, in that it came out of a personal interest of the authors you would like to read, and perhaps is in contrast to a lot of cultural production, which starts with another question, which is, what does my audience want to read? And I was wondering at what point in the creation of Lapham's Quarterly did outside constraints, whether the market or otherwise, lead to moments of compromise or difficult decision-making in terms of the execution of what sounds to me like a very personal project?
Well, no, it is a personal thing, and I didn't compromise it at all. I mean, it's the trick was to raise money for it and to find people who would, you know, put up the funds and let me do it. I mean, I had an idea. I mean, I had a prospectus. I knew exactly how I wanted to do it, and I designed it myself. And again, it borrows from it's an extension of the readings idea for Harper's Magazine, but focused on a theme. And but no, I had my the best job that you can ever have is the one you invent for yourself.
I had the best job you could ever have when I went to lunch with him. Yeah. So anyway, the real answer to your question is subscribe to the magazine. That's the way it's going to flourish, and that's where the money is going to come from. And thank you all for being here, and thank you, Louis, for opening this world up to us all. So this is great.
Thank you.